Hey, Sleepy Oceanographers, welcome aboard. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments so our little crew can span the globe. Get comfy, dim the lights, and if you love drifting off to ocean stories, please subscribe, like, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a midnight tide. Imagine slipping beneath the surface at dusk when the world above is losing its edges and the sea trades glitter for velvet. Down here, sight fades quickly, but sound grows tall. It stretches, wanders, learns the shortcuts only the ocean knows. You float with your breath as a metronome, slow in, slower out, and the first thing you notice is that the water itself seems to hum, an endless soft chorus made of tiny lives and distant shudders. Somewhere far off, the low drum of a ship passes like thunder wrapped in blankets. Nearer, the faint patter of rain reaches you from the surface as a delicate, peppery hiss. But beneath those familiar textures, there are voices you don't quite recognize, shapes made of echo, syllables without letters, an alphabet of pressure and patience. The deep keeps a hallway for these travellers, a hidden lane where sound can slide for hundreds, even thousands of kilometres with hardly a scratch. This gentle duct, born from the way temperature and pressure bend the speed of sound, gathers whispers from far apart places and tucks them into a single slow river. Scientists call it a channel. Sailors long ago just felt it in their ribs and knew that sometimes the sea carried news from beyond the horizon. In this river drift, the strange signatures we've named out of curiosity and bewilderment, rumbling phrases called bloop, upsweep, whistle, slow down, Julia, names that sound like nursery rhymes for the abyss. Each carries its own cadence, its own footprint pressed into the water's memory. Listen long enough and you notice the grammar. Earthquakes write sharp consonants that snap into the dark and fade with a gritty tail. Ice speaks in aching vowels, icebergs rubbing hull against hull, glacier tongues breaking free, flows groaning as they flex, long, mournful notes that wander for days. Volcanic vents mutter and click like kettles about to sing, while landslides tumble in a rushing blur that begins nowhere and ends everywhere. Above all of this, life sings. Blue whales send out notes too low to feel like sound at all, more like a slow-motion pulse that presses your chest and passes through you. Fin whales write dotted lines, rhythmic, measured, like someone tapping a finger on a table several rooms away. Beaked whales hide their conversations in quicksilver clicks far above human hearing, and dolphins paint curls and ribbons that rise and fall like laughter smoothed by distance. The sea is crowded with these stories, so crowded that the quietest ones need cleverness to be heard. Hydrophones, underwater microphones, do that listening for us. Some sit patiently on the seabed, recording year after year, collecting seasons of sound the way tree rings collect weather. Others drift, carried by currents, sketching maps out of noise. Networks of them lace the world's oceans, and when they listen together, they can triangulate, finding the place where a note was born and tracing its path as if watching the wake of a boat under moonlight. From this patchwork of ears, we learn that some mysterious calls bloom each year like migrations of the voice. They show up with the cold, then thin in summer. They surge when ice is forming, or when storms escort colder water south, or when something unseen in the deep decides the timing is right. If you tilt your head, if you imagine yourself as wide as the water, you can hear patterns braided together like ropes. On calm nights, the background crackle of snapping shrimp fades until each isolated pop sounds like a match struck in a cavern. On stormy ones, raindrops and bubbles fizz into a bright, airy sheen that blankets everything. The difference between a drizzle and a downpour becomes measurable as tone and texture. Wind writes cursive, hell leaves staccato. From the shelf edges come the slow, booming rebounds of waves collapsing in shoals and gullies you cannot see. Even sand speaks when currents lift it and let it fall. A soft sandy hiss. The shore's lullaby sent offshore. The riddles grow stranger with scale. Every so often, a sound erupts that is simply too big, too long, too oddly structured to pin on any single source we know. A rise that swells steadily for a minute, then trails off like a train slipping into fog. A harmonized ladder of tones that repeats at midnight for weeks, then vanishes. A solitary baritone that trembles for a heartbeat and returns 7 hours later, as if answering itself across a vast, invisible room. People propose suspects, moving ice, refraction tricks, chorus calls from whales we rarely meet, distant lands cracking under stress. But the water holds the answer behind its back with a small secret smile. It helps to remember that sound is touch at a distance, that what we call hearing underwater is really the sensation of the ocean's body trembling in patterns. So every voice has a shape your own body can feel if you let it. The ocean is generous with these shapes. It offers you the chalk outline of a seamount drawn by echoes as low notes bend around it. It hands you the soft lattice of internal waves, tidal rivers within the sea, that crumple and focus and scatter sound the way heat shimmers distort a desert road. It gives you shadow zones as cozy as a pocket, and bright zones as startling as sunlight. With time, you sense why some signals arrive in little clusters, why others smear into smudges. You begin to tell when a call has bounced from the surface, kissed the bottom, or threaded the silent corridor that sits like a quiet mid-ocean subway. There is a human heartbeat here too. Propellers carve repeating combs through the spectrum as blades slice cavitating bubbles again and again, and the rhythm tells you size and speed the way footsteps do in a stairwell. Cargo ships carry their own signatures, and fishing fleets share a choir loft. Farther down the slope of frequency you hear the machines of exploration, remotely operated vehicles breathing in soft hydraulic sighs, research sonars chirping like mechanical birds, gliders murmuring as they adjust their buoyancy to climb and fall. They are newcomers to an older orchestra, and learning to hear them is part of learning the modern sea. What becomes most curious as you drift is the feeling that this soundscape is both map and mystery. You can follow a fin whale's pulse as it sketches routes older than nations. You can hear the seasons changing as certain calls swell and others thin, as Arctic ice slackens, as storm tracks shift, as plankton blooms confer a dusty hiss on whole regions. You can catch the quieting of shipping lanes on holidays, the sudden uptick when a port opens after weather, the patient chorus of fish at dusk on reefs far away, the brief hush that follows a passing squall. At the same time, the questions grow soft and huge. What purpose do the strange seasonal choruses serve? How do different species share the bandwidth without stepping on each other's lines? What do these calls feel like to the animals that live within them every day, who do not so much hear the ocean as belong to it? Your breathing widens to match the scale of what you're listening to, and you notice how much of the ocean's life is negotiation. Negotiation between noise and need, between calling and being heard. A mother whale keeping her voice low in loud waters, a school of fish timing their creaks and grunts with dusk to be both found and not found. A beaked whale pushing its clicks higher and higher to stay hidden, then resting long in the quiet after a deep dive. Even the mysterious sounds may be forms of negotiation we don't yet speak, coded for distances and depths we rarely reach. Perhaps that slow, steady swell is ice straining against its own weight until a fracture releases and the sea sighs. Perhaps it's the breath of a slope slipping seaward, a sound as inevitable as gravity. Perhaps it's something alive that learned to use the ocean's hallway better than we have. As you hover in the dark, you find that not knowing doesn't diminish the comfort, it increases it. The unknown feels less like a gap, and more like a space held for listening. Each unidentified sound becomes an invitation to pay closer attention, to treat the ocean as a living archive that records without judgment. You can imagine returning to the same patch of water a year from now, and recognizing a pattern that once seemed random, or hearing a tone you thought singular blossom into a season-long refrain. You picture the seabed hydrophone nearby, its small, still presence as it writes hour after hour onto spinning memory, building a novel we only read in fragments. And you float beside it, a single page in a book whose language you are just beginning to understand, letting the next distant syllable roll toward you through the dark water, patient and unhurried, the sea taking its time to speak. Imagine the ocean at night as a single slow breath, black water exhaling under a pale moon, and then, almost shyly, the horizon begins to bloom, not with sparks or sudden flashes like the beach foam that flickers when you kick your feet through it, but with a steady velvety radiance that spreads and settles as if the sea has decided to carry its own moonlight. It starts so gently you wonder if your eyes are doing tricks, if fatigue has layered a soft gauze over everything, but the glow widens, deepens, and soon the ship cuts a path through milk glass. The wake becomes a river of shadow through a luminous plain, and the bow wave looks like torn silk, dimly shining. Even the sky seems to grow quieter to watch. Sailors have told this story for centuries, of nights when the water goes pale all the way to the edge of the world, when the line between sea and sky dissolves and the hull feels like it's sliding across a cloud. They give it different names depending on the coast, but the feeling is the same, an astonished hush, an urge to whisper, as though raising your voice might crack the surface and spill the light. You lean over the rail and notice that your hands, your breath, the tiny movements of rope and fender don't cause the usual firefly bursts you know from shore. The glow is indifferent to you. It is not a series of reactions to your touch, it is a condition of the water itself, like fog, like mood, like an idea the ocean has chosen and is in no hurry to put down. In daylight, this part of the sea might look unremarkable, a plain of blue hiding all the usual busy compromises of life and chemistry. But at night, under the right quiet, the water tells you there is a quorum here, a gathering, a multitude so dense it becomes collective. Somewhere in the micro-thin skin at the surface, where the sea meets air and trades heat and breath, bacteria have reached an agreement with one another. They talk not with words, but with molecules, small drifting signals that measure the crowd. When enough of them sense us, they turn on a shimmering machinery, luciferase, the slow-flaring engine of light. It is not the staccato flare of startled plankton. It's a calm lantern, a declaration of presence, the sea's version of a porch light left on all night. Among those tiny lantern bearers, some live loosely on the marine snow, the endless delicate fall of organic flecks that drifts like winter through warm water. Others gather on slicks, those faint mirror-like patches that skate across the surface when oils and exudates flatten waves into satin, giving light a sheet to glide upon. Stir the water and the glow does not sharpen or bite back. It just folds and reforms, a slow field that forgets you. You can trail your fingers and see a darker, temporary seam where your hand passed, not brighter, as though your touch cast shadow in a room of low lamps. From above, in tools that see luminance when our eyes cannot, there are nights when satellites catch the largest of these glows, whole counties' worth of soft radiance braided into the currents. They appear in the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, off tropical coasts where the sea grows warm and layered, and where winds and eddies can shepherd the community into thin, persistent sheets. The images look like weather maps for a different element, a fluid of light, thickening here, thinning over there, fading at the edges. On ships that happen to pass through, The logs read like postcards from another planet, light as far as could be seen, no waves visible, wake like a dark tunnel. And for a long stretch of time the ocean keeps that light, as though the night has lengthened into a season. It's tempting to declare an explanation and be done, to say bacteria and close the book, but the sea resists single answers. Why here and not there? Why this week and not 10 days before? Why some years with broad swathes and others with none at all? Each of these questions pulls out another thread. The surface microlayer is not simply a film, it is a living exchange counter where chemistry and organism meet wind, where little slicks collect, where invisible waves travel beneath the visible ones and move things into ribbons and roads. A gentle night breeze can herd cells into stripes just a few meters wide, and a shift in temperature can coax them to the top as surely as a bell calls a congregation. Then there's food, the slow rain from above and the garden below, the careful balance between what is enough and what is too much, stress and comfort, both of which can provoke a glow, one as a signal, the other as a kind of steady metabolism of light. If you were floating in it, you might notice that the glow is not uniform if you stare long enough. Some patches breathe brighter, then softer, like schools of fish inhaling in unison, like the ocean playing with its dimmer switch. Perhaps subsurface waves, invisible swells that travel within layers of different temperatures, are focusing and unfocusing the light the way heat shimmers bend a horizon. Perhaps the bacteria riding clumped colonies that rise and fall in faint drafts, their lanterns grouped like winter villages dotting a night plain. You try to catch a rhythm, and for a moment you do, and then it slips, and that slipping is part of the pleasure. There are nights when a ship's crew lowers a bucket over the side and pulls up a sample, the way you scoop a handful of mist to prove to yourself that it's there. In the bucket the glow dulls quickly, as if you've carried a candle outside and the wind has found it. The water no longer has its wide geometry, the little conversations of molecules dissolve into a room too small for whispers. What you glimpse before it fades is enough. Tiny rooms of light blinking like far windows, then dimming as oxygen and motion and scale change the terms of their gathering. You tip the bucket back, and the sea takes its portion back, smoothing over the interruption. A thing that once sounded like myth now has coordinates and timestamps, but it keeps some of its myth intact. You can know that a satellite has seen a bright patch and still fail to reach it before it melts away, like chasing the end of a rainbow. You can understand the enzymes and still be surprised that an ocean can feel lit from within. You can say quorum and think about how many things in the sea depend on hitting thresholds: migration, spawning, bloom and fade, and how often quiet persistence leads to sudden emergence, a switch flicked by numbers finally large enough to change the world. It is soothing to think that the ocean has these slow thresholds, that light can be a gentle byproduct of togetherness on a scale we rarely imagine. The mind wants to give it meaning because that is what minds do. It wants to call the glow a message, a celebration, a truce, a reminder. Perhaps it is simply the chemistry of living together in good company, an incidental halo of a thriving crowd. But it is also undeniably an experience, a sense that the sea has decided to make itself visible without the sun, to turn itself into something you can read without letters. You notice how your breathing mimics the evenness of the glow, how the deck sounds quieter, how the usual hum of the ship recedes a little, and you hear instead the soft hiss of water parting around the bow as if you are moving through a lit fog. It makes familiar things, rope coils, cleats, the curve of a rail, look gentle and unfamiliar, like objects in a quiet museum, and the horizon becomes less a line and more a suggestion of where the glow stops pretending to be sky. There is an odd comforting humility in being the darker thing passing through something luminous. Most nights we are the light and the sea is the absorber. Our lamps paint the water and the water takes it. Tonight, you make a shadow and the ocean wears the light. You imagine a bird gliding low and becoming a darker whisper above a pale sheet. A dolphin cutting a calligraphy stroke that closes itself as soon as the tail passes. Squid in their silent business writing temporary commas. Somewhere just below the surface, larger lives move with no need to announce themselves. The milky sheen is enough to mark their presence by absence. A moving silhouette amid softness. When morning edges into the east, you might expect the glow to shrink away like a dream, but sometimes it lingers even as the sky lightens, a pale memory clinging to the surface until sunshine makes its own arguments. And even after it's gone, your eyes keep wanting to find it, as if the sea should still be telling you that quiet, steady story. Later, when the day has spent itself and the first stars turn on, you look out and wonder if tonight the quorum will gather again, if the little lanterns will agree once more, if the horizon will remember how to bloom. You stand at the rail, letting the dark settle, waiting, not impatiently, but with the kind of patience that feels like listening, and far off, or maybe only in your imagining, the water begins to pale. Dust draws a soft line across the water, and as if a conductor had merely lifted a hand, the deep begins to move. At first it is a shiver within the darkness, a fine static of bodies stirring far below where light is already a rumour. Then the shiver thickens into weather, a low rising front made of transparent bells and glassy arrows, of seed-sized grazers with feathery antennae and shrimp that wear the night like a well-fitted suit. The ocean's elevator hums to life and the cab ascends in perfect silence, floor after floor of the water column filling with travellers who prefer the hallway lamps dim. If you could watch the whole page at once, you would see a living tide lifting hundreds of metres, not in panic but in a patient, confident drift towards supper. The first to slip from the dim are the smallest bureaucrats of the sea, copepods with neat oar strokes, each one a bead with eyes, each one a hunger. They are followed by krill flicking their fans like tiny accordions, by larval fishes that look like punctuation marks, by slick ribbons of salps quietly pulsing like transparent trains. Here and there, comb jellies comb their hair with rows of ciliae that catch stray sparks of bioluminescence and braid them into quick rainbows. The column remembers old roots, so the climb is not random. Layers recognize layers. A cool boundary here, a change in salt there, an oxygen-thin band that the migrants fold around like a scarf. They know where to rise and where to pause, because the sea itself suggests a staircase. What tells them that dinner bell is rung is simple enough to state and complicated enough to keep us humble. Light thins to a particular softness, and 100 quiet clocks align. In each of these bodies sits a set of proteins that wake and doze with the day, a slow tidal heartbeat that keeps time with the sky even when clouds or storms smudge the evening. The tiniest drop in brightness, softer than a candle seen through a curtain, can cue an ascent. On full moon nights the climb halts deeper, a concession to eyes above. On moonless nights, confidence swells and the banquet floats closer to the skin of air. Even wind can edit the script. When waves roughen the surface, the flicker of broken light adds a trembling to the schedule that keeps some cautious and sends others darting ahead. From the perspective of an echo, this migration looks like geology coming to life. Sonar sends pings that return from this moving sheet as if the ocean had grown a false seafloor. At dawn, the false bottom sinks and at dusk it rises, a heartbeat you could track on a calendar. The deep scattering layer it's called, a name that understates its presence. Ship crews once mistook it for land because it felt so solid under sound. If you were to sit with the instruments through a week of evenings, you would see the layer climb with astonishing regularity. A weighted blanket lifting off the bed, pausing, then floating upward again until the upper ocean holds a second, living ceiling that gently sags and resettles as hungry mouths begin to feed. Everything that moves has reasons braided together, like rope. The little grazers come up for the night's buffet of microscopic plants drifting near the surface, where the day's sunlight has been distilled into green sugar. They eat under the cover of darkness to stay out of the crosshairs of larger, sharper eyes. By sunrise, they return to the cool depths where metabolism slows, where living is cheaper, where shadows are thick enough to wear as clothing. The commute is a bargain with risk and energy. Feed where it's rich and safe, rest where it's quiet and frugal. Some carry full bellies down and convert them to small neat pellets that fall like snow toward the sea floor. A private winter that delivers carbon to the deep little letters addressed to the abyss and signed with the name of last night's feast. Where there is movement on this scale, there are chaperones, opportunists, and escorts. Lanternfish writhe with the elevator, their sides freckled with tiny lights they can dim or brighten. A field of stars that helps them disappear by matching the faint glow from above. Squid with arms like careful handwriting patrol the corridors, flashing and fading as they test the air of the water with quick jets. Beaked whales and dolphins pass through like lunar eclipses, sudden, certain, casting temporary night in a darkness already complete. Even the slow and the soft have their ways. Siphonophores, colonial drifters that are several creatures at once, rearrange themselves into conveyor belts that move prey in careful order from capture to digestion, a quiet coordination practice for millions of evenings. If you could hold a lantern to the water without disturbing it, you would see the architecture of the climb. Schools thin into ribbons in tight places, then spread into veils where the water opens like a room. Internal waves, tides moving within the ocean itself, comb the layers and gather critters at the crests the way wind piles leaves. Thermoclines act as mezzanines, offering brief platforms where travellers can rest in different warmth before the next rise. Oxygen minimum zones yawn like dusky tunnels that many avoid and a few endure. Routes chosen by bodies tuned to thinner air. When a slope or seamount reaches up from the seafloor, the migration folds around it like silk around a knuckle, and the shape of the land you cannot see writes its signature in the living flow. From a small camera drifting with the ascent, the banquet looks like gentle weather, a kind of edible fog. Phytoplankton glow faintly as bodies brush them, a soft chemistry lesson written in slow sparks. Mouthparts beat like tiny fans, sieving, counting, choosing. Some grazers are indiscriminate, sweeping anything the right size, while others take one particle and reject the next with a flick of cilia that is somehow both polite and final. Predators rely on outlines more than details, perfectly content with silhouettes against the last tender light leaking down from above. When something startles the crowd, a passing shadow, a change in texture, the whole street inhales at once, a coordinated flutter downward that feels like watching a flock of birds turn inside out. The climb is not a single river, it is a braiding of many, each with its own preferred lane and hour. Some species leave early, testing the dim before most commit. Others linger deep, unhurried, then surge all at once as though pulled by an invisible rope. Many pause in mid-water, not to rest but to synchronize, waiting at a certain brightness as if meeting friends at a familiar doorway. The choreography pays attention to the moon, to weather, to the drift of food, to the subtle pulse of the earth's own internal tide. On some nights it runs like a well-practiced waltz, on others like a patient cue, and on a few like a whisper campaign that sweeps through the crowd and changes everything by degrees. People once thought of this migration as a curiosity pinned to the deep, but it is closer to the ocean's daily breathing. With every rise, mouths open near the surface and close on the evening's bloom. With every fall, The ocean sends what it has borrowed back down as little parcels and ghosted bodies that feed animals living where the sun never visits. The staircase is also a ladder for messages. Nutrients are moved in tiny increments. Oxygen is traded. Chemical signatures are carried up and down like notes passed in class. In time and in some, the commuting multitudes keep a kind of discipline that stabilizes the water column. A quiet governance in which individuals simply mind their nights, and yet the whole ocean keeps better house. There is comfort in how the system tolerates small surprises without losing its rhythm. A storm scours the surface and the crowd rises a little later, thicker in pockets sheltered by currents you cannot see. A patch of unusually warm water stretches across the route, and bodies take the long way, edging around it the way a careful hiker detours a patch of thin ice. The moon grows fat and bright and the ascent pauses deeper for a week, and during that week the upper ocean feels, to your instruments, a shade emptier, while just below it strength gathers. The layering readjusts like blankets when someone turns in their sleep, and by the timing slides back toward its ordinary patience. If you lean in with your ears the way you did before, you can hear the migration too. The night surface snaps with the tiny thunder of shrimp that click and crack to talk and to stun. A low, murmuring texture arrives with the fish, and fades with them. You can even measure the climb by listening to the background noise rising a notch as living things fill the water around the microphone. When morning begins to blue the sky, the recorders hear the opposite. A soft unwinding, a thinning, and the artificial seafloor on the sonar sinks, the false bottom becoming a ghost again. Somewhere in the dim, the last latecomers hurry down the stairwell with crumbs still on their lips, and the day shift, creatures that prefer light as others prefer dark, slides carefully into place. Even here, in what sounds like certainty, questions settle like dust and make the scene more beautiful. How do so many bodies, with so many different eyes and senses, agree on the moment to move? How do they share lanes without constant collision? Why do some choose opposite hours, rising by day and hiding by night as if trying out a different page of the rulebook? There are tricks in play we can name, opsins tuned to faint light, timekeeping molecules that cycle regardless of weather, the taste of changing temperature. But naming is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as belonging to it. What you can belong to, easily, is the feeling of a world that takes the dim as a cue to feed gently and then to rest, and repeats this without boredom or complaint. Near the coast, the migration brushes reefs and canyons and shelves with the same courtesy, detouring around coral heads and curling into bays where larvae drift like pollen under streetlights. Far offshore, it rolls across trenches and plains as steady as a tide you can only witness with patience. At high latitudes, the near-endless summer light shifts the rules and compresses the hours into a twilight feast. In polar winter, moon and stars take their turn as the main lamps, and the ascent moves by their softer metronome. Everywhere the pattern proves tolerant of local dialects. Everywhere the ocean's great staircase continues to rise and sink as if the sea were practicing a breathing exercise. It learned long before our clocks were wound. The longer you watch, the more the migration feels less like a fact and more like a promise that the ocean keeps. It promises that night will be used well, that risk will be met with cunning, that growth will be gathered gently and paid back in careful installments. It promises that the largest movement of animals on Earth can be quiet enough to miss if you don't learn the feel of it, and that learning the feel of it will make other, smaller movements suddenly apparent. The slight thickening of the water at your fingertips, the particular angle of a thin shadow, the way a patch of darkness looks heavier when lanternfish pass beneath it. And as the day edges closer and the shallow water brightens, the staircase calmly turns downward again, a courteous bow to the returning light, a soft reminder that in the ocean the commute is not to a place, but to a pattern, and the pattern is patient and endless and kind. The first sign is a shimmer where there shouldn't be one, a wavering lens draped across the sea floor as if someone had laid a pane of warm glass over a cold table. The ROV's lights touch it and the boundary trembles. Heatless heat mirage, a curtain made of difference. You expect stone, sand, the ordinary mat of deep mud. Instead, there's a surface, quiet, reflective, self-possessed, cupped in a low basin, with a pale shoreline of stiffened sediment. Your eyes insist you're looking at air trapped underwater, a lake resting inside the ocean, and your body believes them because the edge even has a tiny wavelet that runs along the rim and disappears into the dark like a cat slipping behind a door. Lean closer, and the strangeness multiplies. The water in the basin is darker. Almost blue-black where the lights are weakest, and when the current above it stirs, the surface writhes with ripples that don't match the rhythm of the open sea. A brine this heavy keeps its own time. You can watch small pebbles roll to the brink and stop, and thin threads of sediment taper downward and then fall aside, draped over the edge like scarves that miss the hook. The ROV noses forward and the hull's shadow spreads across the pool in a soft ellipse. When the pilot presses gently, thrusters whir, the machine dips, and then, buoyed by density, it bobs like a cork, refused entry by water that is also almost not water. It is hard not to laugh quietly at the idea of a lake you cannot sink into even when you are already submerged. Around the margin, life has drawn a bright ring. Mussel beds crowd the lip like a gathered audience, shells open in small patient ovals. White, feathery bacterial mats drape the mud between them, as if the pool were rimmed with frost. Tube worms pitch their delicate tents and sway in microcurrents you can't see. Nothing crosses the line. A stray fish wanders too confident and tilts, stunned, drifting back from a breath too thick with salt and sulfide. Crab shells lie where curiosity ended, the way driftwood tells you where a storm's reach was strongest. Yet the border is not a wall of death so much as a fence line demarcating two neighborships with different physics. Inside, salt 4 or 5 times stronger than the surrounding sea, oxygen nearly gone, sulfide sharp enough to make a smell you cannot smell at this depth. Outside, ordinary darkness humming with regular business. At the boundary, bargains are struck. Mussels host bacteria that drink methane and breathe sulfate, and in return the mussels are fed from within. Worms do the same with other partners. Lacking sunlight, the economy of the rim runs on the strange energy of buried chemicals, on gases that seep like slow weather from the earth itself. Zoom out and the landscape clarifies. The basin sits on an ancient story. Long before this night, a shallow, evaporating sea left behind thick layers of salt that time folded and pressed into the crust like quilts. Those salts rose in glacial motion, diapers, the geologists say, slow balloons of mineral pushing upward until faults and fractures gave them 1,000 little mouths. The modern ocean seeped through, dissolving, returning with brines that trickled out cold and dense. Where the land dips and the trickle is steady, the brine pools in hollows and pours from ledges as waterfalls that fall without sound. Fingers of heavier liquid sliding down slopes and filling basements you didn't know the ocean had. In some places the brine brings friends. Methane released in soft burps, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, a stew of dissolved minerals that paints the sediment in improbable hues. The seafloor answers with carbonate crusts that grow like low, knuckled reefs and with chimneys the size of toadstools, places where the chemistry of one world meets the chemistry of another and leaves a signature in stone. Sometimes the pool's skin looks perfectly flat, a black coin pressed into mud. Sometimes it appears ruffled, a quilt pinned at the corners and breathing gently. A light current draws a thin tongue of brine out of the basin, and the tongue hugs the ground, winding through a shallow channel, like a river reluctant to call itself river. On another rim, a tiny cascade of denser fluid tumbles from a crease and spreads as a fan, and if the ROV hovers long enough, you can see that fan creep, grain by grain, downstream along a slope you would have sworn was level. In a nearby hollow, bubbles of methane lift lazily from the sediment and pause at the surface in silver hemispheres that hesitate, reluctant to choose between two thick worlds, then shrug and slip away. Every feature you know from air-struck shores is here in miniature. Beaches, rivulets, capes and coves, a tide line etched by chemistry rather than tides. What appears barren from a distance, up close, hums with logistics. Bacteria knit mats thick enough to rustle in the thruster wash, and their filaments hide 1,000 negotiations over oxygen and sulfur and patience. Tiny snails patrol like bead-sized librarians. Shrimp and amphipods gather at the rim and dip in and out with the caution of shoppers measuring a too-hot bath. The mussels' gills are gardens. Inside their tissues live the architect of this place's prosperity. Symbionts that turn methane into sugar and sulfate into a kind of breath, engines without flame. The result is a feast in a kingdom of poison, a banquet built from molecules that in other rooms would be vents, fumes, warnings. The rim is crowded for a reason. It is a marketplace where doom for one body is dinner for another, and the exchange rate is so favourable that animals settle here for lifetimes. From far above, satellites can't see these little lakes. They are secrets told too quietly. But maps of the sea floor, the careful stipple kind drawn by sound, show scatterings of pockmarks and dimples across continental slopes where brine and gas leak upward through old scars. Each depression could be a potential basin, each basin a candidate for a new shoreline. Some are wet, others dry, some shallow and barely different from the sea around them, others deep with steep, slick sides. In the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, there are even places where hypersaline water, fed by buried salt beds, forms rivers and deltas and cataracts inside the sea, complete with banks and turbidity, and tree-like channels cut into soft sediment. Divers sometimes call it a dream of gravity running twice, once for water over air and once for water over water. Stare long enough at the boundary, and you can read a quiet stratigraphy of light. Above the pool, clear seawater drinks the ROV's beams and scatters them with familiar modesty. In the topmost fingers of the brine, the light bends and slows, heat shimmer without heat. A few centimetres deeper, the beam becomes short. The light swallows itself, black syrup absorbing all persuasion. The vertical distance between survivable and not survivable might be the breadth of your hand. Within that span is a chemocline, a redox frontier, where oxygen meets sulfide and the world flips polarity. To a bacterium adapted to that middle, it must feel like living on the ridgepole of a roof, with rich danger pulled on both sides and imperfect food arriving molecule by molecule at the crest. To a mussel, the trick is plumbing, routing fluids so symbionts inside can reach both breath and meal without the host being dissolved by either. The engineering is quiet and astonishing. Every pool has a temperament. Some sit placid and predictable for years, their shores slowly accreting shells until the lip looks like a necklace half buried in silt. Others burp, flood, or recede, their outlines shifting as brine supply waxes and wanes, as slumps nibble their rims, as seafloor quakes wrinkle a wall and open a new mouth. After a storm races overhead, you might find the pool's skin has ruffled with internal waves pushed by pressure changes and distant swell, a weather forecast written for water beneath water. On moon-bright nights, perhaps the migration of midwater animals skims the rim like a passing parade, casting faint shadows across the surface that will not bear their weight. In colder regions, when brine and gas meet at the right pressures, crystals grow, clathrates that look like snow, packed by careful hands, ice that burns if you carry it to a warmer world, a reminder that the boundaries of phase and state are also landscapes. We come with instruments and questions and leave with more of both. How long does a given pool persist? How old is the community at its shore? What quiet succession of species writes the rim's biography as chemistry shifts by inches over decades? Does a pool seed another pool down current with a drift of larvae that know by taste or by time where to settle? When a basin floods and spills, does the river of brine carve a channel that becomes a road for future flows, teaching the ground to remember its own lowest roots? On some days, the instruments give us answers. A probe pushed into the surface confirms salinity strong enough to lift you, oxygen that would make a candle faint, sulfide that would turn metal brief. On other days, the ROV merely hovers and watches, because watching is also a kind of measurement. You learn the patience of the pool, the way it refuses to be hurried, the way a ripple can take 5 seconds to cross 2 meters of skin. The mind wants metaphors, and the place offers them generously. Here is a lake that cannot evaporate, a shoreline untouched by wind, surf built from density not storm. Here is a beach where sands don't dry, where driftwood is replaced by shells of those who misread the room, where tide is the slow seesaw of supply and dissolution. Here is a harbour for animals who long ago gave up the sun and hired chemistry to cook them breakfast. If you needed a single picture to say the ocean is many oceans layered together, you could set a camera at the pool's edge and let it run, and the footage would do the work without narration. A ripple born from nothing, a bubble making up its mind, a shrimp stepping carefully over a border no line on a map could show. When the ROV finally backs away, the beam plays over the slope and you notice the pool's influence extends farther than the eye guessed. The sediment downslope is slick and patterned with little fans and tongues where brine has crept, the way a low tide leaves scalloped edges on a flat. Carbonate crusts glint from beneath a dusting of silt. Farther out, a thin fog of amphipods lifts as a collective and resettles as if deciding together that yes, this is still home. The pool shrinks in the viewport to a coin again, then to a single bright ring around a dark heart, then to a soft bruise on the seafloor. The ocean closes ranks around it without swallowing it. You carry the image with you into the larger dark, a lake with its own weather and its own rules, a room inside a mansion inside a world, a place where the sea chooses to be two things at once and does so with such composure that you feel calmer for having seen it, as if witnessing it has tuned your own inner layers into a temporary harmony, denser thoughts settling gently beneath lighter ones until what's left at the surface is simple, smooth, and quietly lit from below. The first hint is not light but motion, a column of water that seems to wriggle where the deep normally holds itself still, a heat haze without flame rising through 4 degrees of near-freezing dark. Then the ROV's lights catch it and the water turns particulate, inky, peppered, alive with flecks that billow upward like soot. It looks like smoke and behaves like weather, a black blizzard that pours from a rocky mouth and climbs until it finds a layer that will hold it, spreading there as a quiet cloud that drifts on the abyssal wind. You expect any heat to die at once in this cold, but the plume keeps its poise. What leaves the ground at more than 300 degrees does not boil, because pressure insists on a different rulebook, and so hot acidic water bursts into the frigid ocean and makes a storm of minerals that paints the dark. Follow the flow backward, and the story threads down into the seafloor. Seawater seeps through fractures opened by the slow stretch of the mid-ocean ridge, filters down meters and then hundreds of meters into basalt that is warm enough to persuade the water to change character. Magnesium is stripped away, the fluid becomes acidic. It lingers with molten rock and dissolves metals the way a strong tea pulls colour from leaves. Charged with iron, copper, zinc and sulphur, it rises again because hot water is buoyant even at depth, searching for an exit along faults and cracks that act like the chimneys of a buried city. When it meets the ocean proper, cold, alkaline, oxygenated, the chemistry flips. Metal sulfides crash out of solution in a fast snow, dense and fine, making the smoke that gives these fountains their name, and leaving behind, over hours and days and years, a literal chimney built grain by grain around the venting throat. Put a camera on that throat and the architecture is hypnotic. Closest to the orifice, white rims of anhydrite, seafloor plaster, precipitate where hot meets cold, quick to grow and quick to dissolve. Within and over that scaffolding, darker sulfides plate themselves. Chalcopyrite, pyrite, sphalerite, a geologist's pantry erecting columns as tall as houses and as slender as organ pipes. Fluids jet through newly formed cracks and draw filigree, then the structure collapses and begins again, like a cathedral under perpetual renovation. Nearby, pale vents breathe white smoke, barium and silica, and calcium drifting like pale milk, cooler cousins in the same neighbourhood. On a busy field, the horizon bristles with stacks, some roaring, some whispering, some extinct and hollow, their throats glazed and quiet while new mouths open a few metres away. The water between those stacks is a patchwork of climate cells laid cheek by jowl. Here, a shimmering veil marks a temperature step that would scald a hand, if hands were something you could risk in this place. There, a tender snowfall of black particles settles like ash and is whisked up again by the next pulse. The gradient from freezing to furnace spans the width of your arm. That gradient is the room where life has chosen to invent itself again. Bacteria and archaea build their metabolisms not on sunlight but on redox. They take the chemical appetite of hydrogen sulfide and feed it to oxygen. They capture the spare electrons in tidy pathways and use the energy to fix carbon, knitting sugar out of dissolved inorganic carbon, the way leaves do with light. Some prefer nitrate to oxygen, some are generous with methane, some break water to use hydrogen when the geology offers it. The vocabulary is chemistry, the grammar is patience. From that microscopic grammar comes a library of bodies. The giant tube worms stand first among the loud, quiet citizens, pillars of white chitin sleeves with soft scarlet plumes that harvest gases instead of food. They do not bother with mouths or stomachs. Inside their tissues is a padded room, the trophosome, where symbiotic bacteria conduct their invisible photosynthesis without light. The worm's blood carries both sulfide and oxygen at once, via hemoglobin engineered to keep antagonists politely apart until the symbionts can use them. A trick of plumbing that feels like magic until you draw it on a napkin and realise it is engineering as careful as any ship. Around their bases cluster clams and mussels fat with their own endosymbionts, each shell a tidy apartment building with internal gardens that drink methane or sulfide or both. Crabs pick their way along the mineral crusts, patient as janitors. Shrimp crowd in roiling ranks, especially on Atlantic fields, their backs eye-like where light-sensing patches watch the glow of the vent so they can hold station in the sweet spot between feast and burn. On some ridges, yeti crabs knead bacteria on the silky hairs of their arms like farmers tending plots, holding their harvest in the chemical breeze. The plume itself is a conveyor that leaves fingerprints on the basin for kilometres. Rising, it entrains cold water until it finds a density it cannot beat. Then it spreads as a neutrally buoyant lens that carries heat and metals and microbe seeds downstream. Tiny mineral grains rain out slowly to make metalliferous drapes on the seafloor. Copper and zinc and iron laid down as thin, patient layers. Where many chimneys have breathed and died over centuries, the result is a buried harvest called a massive sulfide deposit. An ore body knitted in the dark that tempts the surface world to imagine drills and dredges and brings, along with temptation, questions about what is spent when a silence like this is broken. Even without arguments from the air, the vents adjust their own economies. A tap shuts, an earthquake rearranges a throat, a collapse opens a hotter path, and the community gathers its larvae and recolonizes on the next warm mouth, as if moving day had always been part of the plan. Listen with a hydrophone and the place has a voice. Low rumbles and quick crackles as superheated water flashes minerals into solids, as gases separate and recombine, as walls tick and settle. Put a thermometer into the flow and it climbs as smoothly as a breath to temperatures that would fry pan and pot at the surface. Withdraw it a hand's length and the reading falls through seasons into winter. A drop so steep that the word edge feels too blunt. Slip a probe into the throat and you'll learn pH that bites and redox potential that says plainly which way the energy wants to run. In that run, microbes build options. Some use the Calvin cycle familiar from leaves. Others drive the reverse TCA cycle, flipping a pathway to pull carbon in instead of letting it drift out. The result is not just biomass, but structure. Mats that tuff the rocks like velvet, streamers that flap in the current. Gel films so delicate you see them only when they tear. Every ridge has its dialect. In the Pacific, tubeworm forests sway like a pale meadow. In the Atlantic, armoured shrimp press so close the chimney seems to wear fur. In the Indian Ocean, squat lobsters and mussels furnish the terraces. The distance between fields and the currents that speak between them shape which larvae can make the trip, so each province wears a different cast, and yet the plot feels the same. New vents are colonised by hardy generalists, and then, as chemistry stabilises and walls grow, the specialists arrive and the scene becomes a long conversation between fluid and flesh, each editing the other. When an eruption paves the floor with fresh basalt and silences a field, months later the first white blurs reappear, then flickers of red plumes, then the old density returns with a slightly altered accent. To an ROV that visits every few years, it reads as time-lapse of a city that refuses to stay destroyed. Nothing in the look of the chimneys signals how old the idea is. Hydrothermal flow could have been with the planet since rock first met water and heat. Alkaline cousins on other ridges build chalky towers that exhale hydrogen and methane, and thinkers imagine early cells beginning in such pores, proton gradients ready-made, membranes and enzymes learning their craft with geology as teacher. Here at the Black Smokers, the lesson is more turbulent, but the principle is similar. Boundary plus flow plus gradient equals possibility. Even at the hottest margins, hyperthermophiles ride the edge, enzymes folded to keep their composure where ours would slump. To call the place extreme is to confess that our room is elsewhere. Here the baseline is simply different, and bodies that belong here take it as calmly as trees take light. Move the camera a little way off and the contrast sharpens, the wide dark plain mottled with manganese nodules and scattered sea stars, and then, abruptly, heat's signature. Glints of fresh sulfide, walls wet with rising shimmer, small animals clustered like pilgrims on a step. The ROV's lights cut a cross-section through the plume, and you can see the grains thick at the core, thinning outward into clean water, the same gradient that life has learned to harvest printed in mineral. On the seafloor below, a dusting of black falls like slow rain, and then lifts again when a new cough of fluid surges. A crab climbs a ledge that did not exist last season. A worm's scarlet plume folds and opens like a hand testing the flavour of the current. The chimney exhales, the water swirls, and for a moment the whole edifice looks less like rock and more like a candle frozen mid-flame, a sculpture of motion that never quite decides to hold still. All the while the big ocean ignores the drama with its usual gravity. A few meters from the tallest stack, the abyssal water keeps to its pace, oxygen moving in its patient loops, cold creeping along the bottom with no opinion about sulphur or copper. The plume's shadow passes and is forgotten. But the memory of the work done here travels, in the bodies that drift and the particles that settle, in the heat discharged into a volume too large to notice and yet not entirely unchanged by countless small insistences. The ridge goes on for tens of thousands of kilometres, a stitched seam across the planet, and along that seam these small furnaces flare and dim and flare again. You can hover at one and feel the whole seam implied, a continuous opportunity for stone, water and heat to try something together and keep trying until the chemistry arranges itself into a scaffolding that life can climb, breath by breath, and electron by electron, warmer than the night around it and steady enough to anchor a city in the cold. The first sign is absence, a patch of dark that seems darker than the dark around it, moving with the patience of a drifting cloud. You're hovering in water that feels like velvet on the microphones and glass on the eyes, and somewhere just outside the cone of the ROV's red light a shape rearranges the night. No flare, no thrash, only the quiet suggestion of mass. A hush passes over the instruments, as if they have decided together to listen harder. Then the edge of the unknown tilts, and you catch a plane of skin, copper brown, textured like fine cloth, and for a breath the deep shows you a curve, a fin, a fold, and then folds the sight back into itself again. Most of what we know about these giants has been written in other animals' skin and stomachs. Pale rings of sucker scars laddering the heads of sperm whales, parrot beaks, glossy and black, nested like matryoshka in the coils of a whale's gut. Long, limp mantles. A storm washed ashore and left on a cold beach like a failed magic trick. Their story arrives as evidence rather than appearance. But piece by piece a body emerges, a mantle long as a small car, fins like rounded pennants, arms thick with suckers whose rims are armoured in chitin, some with serrations that turn embrace into grip, grip into signature. Two feeding tentacles extend beyond all the others, ending in clubs crowded with those ringed mouths, harvesting hands that can shoot forward close and pull a resisting world inward. The eyes are the clearest sentence. You can see the logic at a glance. Orbs as wide as dinner plates, the largest eyes known, tuned for a landscape where light is a rumour, and life announces itself mostly by disturbance. Those eyes are not for detail but for significance. A distant ribbon of bioluminescence snaps off in a line that could only be a whale. A faint aureole of plankton stirs somewhere above. A thin shadow crosses a glimmer and marks the passing of a fish worth the effort. In that dim, big eyes are brighter minds. They take what little is given and turn it into enough. In the columns of cold, these animals float not by lung or swim bladder, but by chemistry. Their bodies hold a little ammonium, a built-in lighter than seawater that makes the whole animal near neutral, as effortless as a leaf in still air. Jet propulsion is there when needed, mantle cavity gulping and firing water through a flexible funnel to send the body forward with a muted cough of speed. But the default is unhurried, fins tracing slow figure eights, arms cupped around a widening hollow of night, tentacles gathered like kite strings waiting for a wind that is prey. Hemocyanin carries oxygen in blue-lit blood. The brain is a ring donut of nervous tissue, a literal circuit around a narrow esophagus because the design insists that thinking must host hunger and let dinner pass through its centre. You catch a flash of texture along one arm, suckers in neat ranks, faces turned outward like coins laid edge to edge, each rim armed with a ring that could rasp if asked. On the colossal cousin, far south where the water stacks itself into ice and ink, Hooks take the place of some rings, curved, swivel-mounted, eager to worry flesh that tries to flee. Hook, ring, grip, pull. Beak meets what the arms deliver. Teeth without jawbones live in the tongue and the radula, a conveyor of points that saws a meal into swallowable patience. Ink exists here too, a dark punctuation, though at depth the gesture is more ritual than utility, more muscle memory than guarantee. Predators have ears that ignore smoke and eyes that stare through it, clicking their way to you as though the water were glass scored with sound. Because the deep writes slow, the body grows fast. A life that reaches great length in a handful of years spends little time practicing. It must get on with it. Protein is turned into motion, motion into capture, capture into more length, more strength, more nerve. Statoliths in the head add layers like trees, add rings, ticking off days and calcium. The giant is proof of a bargain struck well, grow quickly to sizes that deter some mouths and require bigger mouths to hazard you. Trade long tenure for short grandeur. Live at the scale of whale scars, not sardine glints. When the lights don't touch it, you read the animal by its world. Lanternfish scatter like sand in a gust, painting the water with faint dots that go out in patterns that look like weather on a radar screen. A tufty coat of amphipods lifts from the carcass of something that was not fast enough and drifts back to the bottom on your disturbance. Then everything stills, and you realize the stillness is a choice the giant is making. There is a way to become background even when you are the size of a small car. Align your arms with the faint current. Show the edge of a fin at the same angle as a patch of dark behind it. Let chromatophores relax until your skin takes on the mottled understatement of the midwater, a compromise between copper and storm. If the whale is the deep's bell, the giant is a shadow that has learned the bell's song. Somewhere off-screen, a series of clicks begins, rising in volume, narrowing in spacing until each click is less a note than a hammer. The whale's biosonar writes a tight, bright line through the water, printing outlines on its inner ear. The giant hears a pressure it may not pass as sound, but certainly feels as insistence. Some say the squids flatten and hold. Others tell of sudden speed, burst the length of a room and the breadth of a heartbeat. The scars say a deal is often struck up close, at arm's length, where ringed suckers leave circular welts like a chain of moons on a whale's jaw, and the beak leaves nothing at all except the memory of weight. Reproduction happens off stage, as if the deep would prefer to keep that part unfilmed. The male spermatophores are needles and springs, tiny spears that lodge and wait, numbering into the thousands, storage instead of ceremony. Female bodies are heavy with eggs that drift upward after release and hatch to paralarvae. So clear they almost aren't there, glass threads with eyes and promise. They live in a lighter floor of the water column at first, held where food is abundant and danger diffuse, and then they draft downward, lengthening and learning the slower grammar of the deep. No one records a courtship dance. The choreography here is economy, a meeting that may be as brief as an exchange of devices and then distance again, each animal returning to the cold math of its commute between food and safety. Close, the skin is a book. Chromatophores speckle and spread, turning to patches from pale to rust in a blink. Iridophores underneath add sheen, like oil under tissue, like quiet lightning. A wounded area blooms darker, a live-in bandage. A message passes along an arm, and the pattern ripples as if a thought had been made visible in flesh. In the cone of red light you do not see the true colours because red barely reaches here. To your cameras the tones are silvered and thin, but the movement carries the same sense. Not panic, not fear, just adjustments, as if the animal were rehearsing hundreds of small decisions it might need later in a moment that will allow no rehearsal at all. A myth once put this shape on maps as a hazard to ships, a kraken that dallied with anchors and loved a mast. The truth is a life wrapped in quiet choices within a physics that is indifferent to drama. The arms test, the tentacles wait, the fins write their slow cursive. Sometimes the giant uses the current as a stair, hanging like a kite on an invisible string, letting food flow to it. Sometimes it flies, a handful of powerful jets, then a glide, then another breath drawn not from air but from the thin soup of dissolved oxygen fanning across its gills. It knows the seasons of the deep, the way trees know lengthening light, unhurried and exact. It rises on nights when the midwater is fat with bodies, and sinks when the moon sharpens the risks, its schedule tuned to a harvest no calendar marks. Evidence becomes encounter more often now, because patience has improved. Cameras have learned to hide in red, to ignore their own noise, to anchor bait that is more suggestion than lure. The first time filmed in natural darkness, the animal came from below, an ember turning into a sentence, arms flaring, a careful inspection that did not feel like hunger so much as curiosity. Later records show a mantle filling the screen, not like a monster but like a weather front, a passing pressure change that happened to wear suckers. The more we watch, the more the animals remain themselves, which is the comfort. Observation that subtracts little, that lets the object keep its secrets and still be seen. If you imagine the deep as rooms, the giant is a moving doorway between them, a body that fits this pressure, this chemistry, this speed of thought. It has the courtesy of its place. It leaves few traces when it goes, and those traces are gifts to other mouths. It participates in the carbon traffic, taking what floats down and sometimes becoming part of the slow rain itself when time insists. When it meets a peer, perhaps the exchange is brief, perhaps longer, perhaps two giants spiral a little the way kites sometimes tangle and untangle on a windy afternoon. Perhaps the midwater witnesses more tenderness than we have learned to recognise with our instruments tuned to tug and click. The ROV's altimeter ticks softly, distance to the empty beneath you measured in decibels of absence. To starboard, the scattering layer is beginning its quiet ascent, a faint snowfall of bodies returning to the shallows to feed. The giant sidles along the edge of that living ceiling and becomes less outline, more rumour again. There is a feeling you come to know here that is not fear and not awe, but a clean, eachful smallness, as if your entire self has been scaled to the size of a single sucker ring. It is easy to be gentle when you feel that small. The animal moves and the water heaves only slightly. A few copepods drift in the wake like dust in a hall after someone walks by. Your lights dim a fraction to give the night back to itself. The last thing you see is an eye looking past you rather than at you, measuring some distant tremor, calculating some private geometry of distance and approach. And then the patch of dark resumes being only dark. The shape becomes only water again, and you sit very quietly in the quiet, aware that an absence can be the most honest kind of presence the deep is willing to share. The first thing you notice is the stillness, as if a piece of the water has decided to stop being water and become patience instead. It hangs there like a thought you don't want to disturb, a small dark-bodied fish with a crystal dome where most creatures keep skull and scale. In the gentle glow of the ROV's red light, the dome is a lens, smooth as a drop of glass, and inside it 2 emerald cylinders stand upright like periscopes gazing into the ceiling of night. Not eyes the way we use the word, not globes that swivel in sockets, but tubes, bright at the tips, focused with a devotion that feels both ancient and surgical. The rest of the head is quiet, a small mouth set just so, a soft curtain of translucent tissue that folds into the dome without a seam, fins poised like careful hands. You try not to breathe too loudly through the speakers because the animal is the kind that believes in stillness more than speed. It keeps station with the smallest tilts, the faintest flick of pectoral fin. A tiny sail of dorsal fin, almost comically modest, flexes like a fingertip to rotate the whole body a few degrees left, then back again. There is a feeling here of someone listening in a language you do not speak, listening with green filters that turn the blackness into something legible, singling out the faintest freckles of bioluminescence from the clutter of faraway skylight. Those emerald lenses are not for glamour. They are a shield against glare, a way to edit out the last tired blue that reaches this depth, so that living sparks stand out as clearly as stars from dusk. The dome is a window and also a helmet, a clear bell of fluid and membrane that lets those delicate tubes look up without meeting stings and splinters head-on. The midwater has forests of glass and thread, siphonophores and their confederates, strings of traps and bells with nettle-loaded hairs, and the fish's world is braided with those drifting snares. The window keeps the eyes safe in a thicket where every brush could be a lesson. Watch long enough and you see the barrel eyes do something that breaks your assumption gently in half. They tip. The tubes, which a moment ago stood like twin telescopes pointing heavenward, swing forward beneath the dome with the grace of a hinge, so that now the animal can look not just into the dim roof for silhouettes, but straight ahead at whatever reward its patience has brought within reach. Above, a slow parade goes by in negative, tiny animals rising with the evening commute, their soft lights turning on and off like a language written without vowels. A ribbon of a siphonophore drifts across the scene, a living fishing line studded with lures, meals hanging like commas along a sentence that never ends. The fish waits. There is a small recalculation in the posture, barely a breath, and the eyes swivel forward again. The mouth, which seemed small for a hunter, is exactly the right size for a thief. The fish will not wrestle, it will not chase, it will lift a tidbit from the stinging pantry with a quick, precise nip, a punctuation mark after someone else's work. Then the eyes swing back upward and the body becomes patience again. There is beauty in how the parts belong to the place. The fins are wide enough to hold a hover without wasting breath. The body is dark where darkness should be dark, and glass where seeing must be done through hazard. The eye tubes are long because the world here is a geometry of faintness, twice the length for twice the photons, twice the chance to tell a signal from a smear. Those green caps at the tips are like dim room glasses, cut the glare, keep the whisper of planktonic light. And with that filtering, the fish reads a script that looks like static to everyone else. A jelly blinks and the tubes lean a degree. A copepod kicks and the tubes correct. If the midwater is a library written in pinpricks and hush, this is the patron who knows exactly which shelf to check. The dome catches the ROV's light and throws back a small, perfect reflection of the deep. A tiny model ocean trembling on the fish's head. In that reflection you can see the shape of the animal's attention. Narrow, steady, patient. You wonder what it means to live with your eyes in a greenhouse, to look through your own skull the way a diver peers from a bell. The fluid inside keeps optical tricks from bending the fish's world the wrong way. The membrane keeps chemistry from interfering with clarity. The effect is not only protection, but permanence of view, nothing between eye and ceiling except what belongs there. When the fish does move, the shift is a sentence rather than a shout. The dorsal fin writes a small instruction in the water, and the body rotates as if pivoting on a slow axis through its centre. The pectorals whisper a correction. The caudal fin adds the final syllable. For a few seconds the eyes aim forward again, and you see the benefit of this odd architecture. A look up to find the outline, a look forward to seize the moment, a look up again to read the next sign. It is a two-stage dance with the dim that wastes nothing and asks little. Many predators rely on speed. This one relies on certainty, and the certainty comes from seeing the barely visible with instruments tuned like instruments in a chamber orchestra. Quiet, exact, made for rooms where noise would be a sin. Everything about the fish says that the midwater is not a blank but a texture, and that textures can be read by those who have built themselves into lenses. Around it the weather changes. This hour, a thin drizzle of marine snow. The next, a calmer, lacy fall of molts and jelly scraps. Then for a spell, clear lanes where current has swept detritus into fluted ridges, and the light seems cleaner for a dozen meters. In each kind of weather the barrel eyes find something to track. A sudden right angle in the drift that can only be a body twitching. A flicker that is not the sky. A soft patch of darkness that holds shape a fraction too long. You begin to suspect that the fish and the siphonophore are old acquaintances, bound by that slow economics the sea favours. The siphonophore fishes with stings and nets and a conveyor belt of mouths. The fish follows the edge of the net like a careful shopper, taking what won't be missed, making just enough disturbance to keep the next snack moving along. The dome protects their eyes from the perimeter wires. The green filters make the lure's imposter glow hang in high relief against the ceiling's last blue. The fish completes the sentence the siphonophore began, and together they keep the paragraph flowing without either ever needing to meet as equals. There's a quiet humour in the fish's expressionless face. The mouth is an unargumentative line, the body offers no hints of drama, but the eyes, for all their tubular seriousness, wear an alertness that borders on charm. When they swing forward, you have the sense of someone peeking around a corner. When they aim up, of someone stargazing through a perfectly clean skylight. The sensation of being watched is replaced by the sensation of being overlooked politely. You are not food, you do not glow correctly, you don't have the courtesy to flicker. Around the fish, the faint geometry of the deep scattering layer slides by, a living ceiling coming into its evening shape. Lanternfish notes ride in a sheet of tiny constellations. Shrimp add percussion. The jellies orchestrate their soft arpeggios, and the fish remains a single violin holding a long, unbroken tone. If you were to draw this on paper, you would shade a rectangle for the ocean and lay over it a series of thin, moving bands, one for light, one for food, one for the gentle tide of animals, and then, near the middle link, a little almond of patience with two green lanterns inside. That would be enough to say what happens here most nights of most years, a waiting perfectly suited to a world that almost never shouts. Your mind keeps returning to how the fish solves problems by refusing to make them fast. It does not blink because it does not need eyelids. It does not sprint because the quarry, once spotted, is very near, having already been gathered by drifting tools the fish did not have to build. It saves effort by spending attention, and it invests attention where the ceiling is. Many creatures in the twilight look sideways. This one begins by looking up, which feels like a kind of optimism. Assume the world will deliver from above. Assume that the dim will write its intentions on the roof. Assume that a careful life is the right kind of speed. A thin thread of marine snow glances off the dome and swirls away in a little eddy, and for an instant the eddy reveals the shape of the invisible flows that hold the fish in place. There is a physics lesson tucked between the slow beats of the fins, lift gained with angle, drag managed with pose, rotation traded with minimal thrust. The fish has learned to make the water do the majority of the work, to lean into density the way a hawk leans into wind, to substitute poise for force. The dome itself may help, smooth, rounded, slipway for the water to pass without twisting the head, a way to keep the image steady in a room that is always moving. Sometimes a second fish appears, not as a revelation, but as an echo, another patient almond, another subtle lantern under glass. hovering a few body lengths away as if they were two punctuation marks bracketing a thought. They do not acknowledge each other in any busy way. A small rotation here, an eyes-forward glance there, then both return to reading the ceiling. Perhaps their encounter is nothing more than overlapping schedules on a well-travelled lane. Perhaps it is a quiet reminder that even the most solitary-seeming strategies are often practiced in company, that a corridor of good seeing will attract all who are built for it, and that the deep allows for parallel lives without competition raising its voice. The ROV holds still and the seconds stack like pages. A transparent amphipod jitters through the dome's reflection and vanishes. A tiny Medusa drifts by with an air of being both lost and perfectly on time. A particle lands on the fish's window and slides off with absurd dignity. When at last the fish tilts, it is to follow the slow descent of a morsel you did not notice until the eyes told you where to look. The tubes swing forward. The mouth opens just enough. The body advances by a single elegant syllable of fin and jet. And then, just as quickly, the posture resets. The tubes climb back under the dome, the ceiling becomes the book again, and the patience resumes with the unbothered, glassy composure of something that has solved its life at the level of first principles and sees no reason to reconsider them tonight. The slope appears first, a gentle terrace of dark rock and pale sediment, where the water itself seems to waver, as if a mirage has been laid a few fingers above the ground. Then the shimmer resolves into a soft, continual flutter, the signature of warm seepage, heat without flame rising into near-freezing black. In that trembling curtain you begin to see shapes that at first read as stones arranged by chance, then as careful choices, low dens tucked beneath ledges, doorways outlined in pebbles, shells stacked like small fences, and at each threshold a presence holding very still, arms curled in a loose wreath, mantle like a folded moon, eyes that look both patient and bright, the kind of brightness you get from a polished stone rather than a lamp. Each den houses a quiet project. From the ceiling and walls hang clusters of eggs, pale and firm as grains of rice strung into tidy bunches. In the ROV's subdued red light they shine with a pearly restraint, not glowing so much as gently refusing the dark. The mother sits with arms slightly arched to make a sheltered chamber, siphon angled just so, a slow metronome of water passing over the eggs to keep them clean and oxygenated. Every few breaths, a deliberate fan from the web and suckers sends a sigh through the cluster, lifting and settling it like seagrass in a breeze. When a strand gathers a dusting of the ocean's snow, fine flakes of life fallen from above, she reaches with the gentlest end of an arm and brushes it away. The gesture is deliberate enough to feel like a sentence, unhurried enough to be a lullaby. The warm seep runs like a hidden thread through it all. The water just above the dens shivers with a few degrees of difference, a microclimate stitched into the cold. It makes the chemistry kinder and the clock faster. Embryos turn inside their cases a little more often. Hearts begin their practice tap sooner. A faint split of pigment appears where eyes will gaze from behind their tiny windows. Along the garden there is a gradient you can read in a slow walk of your lights. Here, newly laid clusters, milk white and opaque. There, specks within that look back when your angle is right. Farther on, eggs so translucent you can see minuscule arms tucked like petals around a central yolk. Every den is a page of the same book read at a slightly different pace. The entire slope a library of time. The mothers have made the architecture together, though the designs are individual and often with a kind of shy pride. Some have built rock lips around their doorways, a small parapet to blunt the current. Others have pulled a fallen shell partway over the entrance like a lid that has decided it prefers to be a door. Middens mark old meals and careful tidying. Crab legs stacked like discarded chopsticks. Snail shells turned into beads of the necklace that circles a home. The colours they wear to keep house are not the flamboyant quicksilver of a hunting afternoon. They are the subdued tones of dusk, soft lavender, gentle brown, a mottled compromise meant to be background. Papillae flatten, skin sleekens, and the whole animal looks smoother, as if it had ironed itself to keep from snagging on the job. There is a softness in the sound the camera does not record, but your imagination supplies. The faint hiss of water through a siphon, the brush of a sucker rasping over a pebble to smooth it into place, the small knock of a shell adjusted, the shiver of warm seep over rock, making an almost voice in the current. Every few minutes a mother lifts her third right arm a fraction and reaches into the egg bundle to pluck away a thread that does not belong, as deft as a seamstress finding a single hair on a wedding dress. Then stillness again, and fanning, and the tiny muscle at the rear of her mantle pulses, 3 hearts content to be metronomes in a room where the only urgency is carefulness. At the edge of the garden, commuters pass with the evening, eel pouts sliding like long, patient thoughts, brittle stars crossing in a hurry that reads as fussy housekeeping, little snails tracing cursive along the margins where bacterial mats write their chalky script. A crab considers a doorway and changes its mind. An anemone opens on a rock and becomes a fixed punctuation mark in a paragraph of dens. Nothing rushes, and yet everything understands that a nursery is also a border, and borders produce both curiosity and appetite. A mother watches. If a hungry, insistent smallness insists, she becomes large enough to occupy the doorway from stone to stone, arms lifting and lowering with the assured authority of a curtain. On nights when the migration rises, shadows flicker across the garden, like slow clouds. The mothers do not join. For them, life is now a devotion with a single object. Octopuses are built for change, skin that can become bark or sand, a body that can pour itself through a keyhole, but motherhood asks for the opposite. Here the miracle is that so much life can be made by staying. They will not eat, will not hunt, will not stray beyond the line of their doorway, except to push a small rock into a better place or retrieve a single egg that slipped. Wound healing and appetite go quiet. The hush of senescence begins like a long, low tide. Meanwhile the eyes remain bright and the hands precise. If you wanted a portrait of endurance, you would set your camera here and leave it until the lens fogged with warmth. The warmth, too, is a form of gentleness with teeth. It speeds what would otherwise be a wait measured in long months or years, bringing a deep-sea schedule closer to a surface summer, compressing risk and compressing hope. But warmth is not alone. The seep has its own little weather. Chemicals rising that would suffocate a body unprepared. Microbes make a living just outside the nursery curtain. Chalk-white sheets draped over rock like low fog. And the family line of life here includes invisible partners who turn sulfide and methane into food for others. A quiet subsidy paid into the nursery's account from the Earth's own pockets. The mothers position their dens where the warm and the safe overlap in a narrow Venn diagram, a sweet spot learned not by book but by lineage and experiment. Every garden has its neighbourhood rules. A newcomer arrives, her body a bit brighter, her skin a little more textured, and circles once, testing the light and the chemistry, then backs into a cavity and begins the work of turning a hole in rock into a home. The arc of her arms writes the same slow semicircle the others are tracing. When the eggs come, she arranges them in careful swags and binds them to stone with threads sticky as patience. Across the slope one cluster hatches in a drift of tiny departures, thumbnail hearts, transparent cloaks, little jet pulses that look like punctuation lifted from a page and set in motion. They hover just outside the doorway, blinking into awareness, and then the microcurrents catch them and guide them along the warm seam out into the greater hallway where the evening traffic is flowing. The mother, hollow now with the effort, fans the empty threads as if convincing her arms of what they already know, and settles again, as if there is still one more fleck of dust to brush away, one more rock to slide into a closer fit. A male passes the way a breeze passes, a little briskness, a little newness, and you think of the earlier chapter in this story, the moment when a Hectocotylus reached and placed its small time-release gifts in just the right pocket, a brief encounter that began this patient season. His life is also on a short trajectory. Somewhere not far he too is winding down, the lights of appetite and repair dimming. In this garden, adulthood is a tide that moves only once in each direction, and the direction is toward giving more than remains for keeping. The generosity shows up in the arithmetic of the place. Every hatchling that leaves is a coin pressed into the palm of the wider sea. Every body that stays when its own job is done becomes food for the neighbours who did their work last season, or will do it next. There is order without a captain. No mother commands the slope, no schedule is posted, and yet the dens are spaced so the fanning of one does not steal another's breath. Entrances angle away from prevailing flow. Egg clusters hang where eddies will swish them like laundry in a soft breeze, rather than batter them like flags. If you ran dye through the neighbourhood, you would see blue-green ribbons folding and unfolding in ways that are anything but random. Arms adjust, stones slide, the fabric of the current is tailored nightly, and 1,000 tiny decisions add up to a well-ventilated city. Time here is readable if you sit long enough. The embryos pass their milestones. First the faintest comma of a spine to be, then a pair of dots like spilled ink that are actually eyes staring from the future, then little mottlings where chromatophores practice opening and closing, a rehearsal for a life of quick papers held up to the world. You can see them turn within the eggs when the mother fans, a roll and a tuck, the kinds of movements that teach muscles what being a body will feel like. Somewhere halfway down the slope a cluster shivers with a coordinated tremble that looks like rain on a window for a few seconds, and from the edges of the bunch, one by one, tiny bodies let go, like a breath you didn't know you were holding, and drift into the live, soft river above the warmth. Small dramas cross the threshold and are resolved without spectacle. A brittle star reaches and is gently refused. A curious fish peers in and is regarded from an angle that suggests disinterest that can become action if needed. An opportunistic snail tests the lip of the parapet and finds the neighbourhood unprofitable. The mothers do not threaten, they occupy. Space taken up by a body with intention is a form of kindness to that body's project, and the kindness radiates as a safety that can be measured in things that do not happen. Lost clutches, broken strands, stolen futures that never became thefts because an arm was already there. Even the light feels curated. The ROV keeps to its dimmest comfort, an ember rather than a lamp, and from that restraint something delicate becomes visible. The way the heat shimmer warps the edge of a den as if the garden were breathing. The silvery dust of marine snow lifting just above the eggs and settling again in time with them at the mother's fan. The tiny staccato pulses in a late-stage cluster, each with its own rhythm that will become a personality if one can say such a thing about a creature built to be many moods at once. When you ease the lights farther down slope, the garden continues. Another terrace and then another, each with its own pattern, the entire edifice of patience terraced like a rice field of time. You cannot help doing your own small housekeeping in the face of it, tidying your thoughts the way the mothers tidy their doorways, smoothing the stones of attention into a ring around this particular patch of world. The sea is full of noise and distance, of grand storms and long drifts. But here it has chosen closeness and a low voice, warmth and repetition, a few degrees of hospitality extended across 100 metres of nursery. If you were to leave and return months later, the faces would be different and the work the same. The warm seam would still scribble its little signature in the current. New doorways would have learned the exact angle of the flow. Eggs would hang like frosted grapes. Small hands would be doing large work with the same unshowy grace. The garden would be humming exactly as it is now, teaching by example how to make a world with patience and a pulse and a willingness to hold very still for as long as it takes. At first, the plane is an exercise in sameness. Fine silt smoothed into grey silk, a horizon that refuses to pick a detail, until the camera tilts and the ground writes a dotted line across itself. Not pebbles, not shells, but holes neat as stitching. Each one the size of a coin or 2 coins side by side, each with the lip just proud enough to catch a shadow. Each spaced so regularly that your mind trips over the word intentional before it remembers it is 3 kilometers below any human hand. The row runs straight for meters, then bends with a courtesy that looks like planning, then straightens again, crossing a faint ripple in the sediment without losing its rhythm. Somewhere beyond the edge of the lights there are more, parallel to the first like lanes on a running track, and for a moment the abyss looks less like wilderness and more like a quiet manuscript dotted with punctuation you have not yet learned to read. You ease the thrusters and the ROV drifts in slow, breath-length pulses. The first hole is the colour of old paper. The rim looks tamped, as if pressed by the mouth of something that prefers tidy entrances. When the manipulator's probe touches the edge, the sediment collapses softly, and a puff of pale fluff rises and falls like a sigh. The hole is deeper than it looks. You lower a thin wand tipped with dye, and let a single teardrop touch the entrance. It hangs, trembles, then slides downward and vanishes. The dye does not return through the same opening. 2 holes over you try again, and the colour reappears from a neighbour's mouth as if the seabed exhaled in a different place than it inhaled. Somewhere beneath the plane, a narrow hallway connects these dots, a U-shaped burrow or a string of rooms with doors on some separate streets. Bioturbation is the tidy word, but what you are seeing feels closer to a city plan laid under a blanket. Follow the line, the pattern asserts itself in little variations, the way a melody does when it's played by different hands. Some holes sit in pairs, close enough that the rims kiss. Others keep a spacing that would fit 3 of your gloved fingers between them. In one stretch, the alignment respects the direction of the faint bottom current. Each aperture turned a few degrees lee side so that a tiny eddy will feed it fresh water. In another, the dots cross an older animal's trail, and the rim of one hole is scuffed where a sea cucumber's slow foot disturbed it and left a spiral of crumbs. Every disturbance is informative. The airy fluff layer on the surface blows like dust with the smallest thruster nudge, but the rims of the holes resist, a sign that something has been reinforcing them from below with a sort of spool of silk or a ring of compacted grains. A little further on, another punctuation mark in the grammar of the plane. Shallow pits, wider than the holes, soft-edged, arranged like dimples on a giant cushion, spread in a vague lattice for 20 or 30 metres. Heart urchins do this, you think. Irregular urchins that plough headfirst beneath the sediment, eating their way through fine particles and leaving, while you are sleeping, notes behind. Their spines comb and their bodies lift, and as they feed they push the surface inward and up, digging invisible galleries whose roofs later slump into these gentle pans. If you look closely, a sprinkle of coarser grains has gathered around the lips of each pit where tiny recirculation sorted them from the finer rain. The pattern is less regular than the beadwork of holes, but it rhymes, and the rhyme is food and oxygen and patience. The row of holes resumes beyond the urchin pasture and grows stranger. Here the dots occur in long pairs like piano keys, right left, left. Stepping across the plain in a gait that could be read as the track of a cautious creature walking beneath its own blanket. You imagine a burrower that travels, testing, sampling, poking up for a taste of water or a sniff of chemical and then moving on, leaving the ceiling dotted with small skylights. Or perhaps this is how a sedentary engineer ventilates, Draw fresh water through one mouth, flush wastewater through the other, keep the oxygen and the smell of neighbours in balance, keep predators guessing which door matters. Polycate worms do this with neat U-bends and patient pumping. Shrimps of the ghostly families Axiid and Callianacid backfill and reopen, their little piston lives leaving a Morse code of holes that persists until the next quiet storm of silt erases the sentence and the animal writes it again. You switch to the side camera and catch a sliver of something pale withdrawing in the instant the light sweeps the hole. A thin lamp wick body, annelid perhaps, that slipped down like the last noodle in a bowl. That is evidence, not confession, and the plane is tight-lipped. Where the holes are freshest, the rims are crisp, and the interiors are shadow-richer than the surrounding mud. Where they are older, a dusting of marine snow has begun to blur the edges, and a film of bacteria glints pearl-pale if you tilt the lights just right. Time is visible as a softening. Age is recorded in radius and brightness. You place a ruler stake for scale and note the spacing. 24 centimetres here, 25 to there, a standard deviation you could hang a paper on if you were in the mood for such hanging. Patterns at this depth sometimes pretend to be aliens because we love a story with an author, but the plainer story is good enough to keep. Beneath the apparently flat abyss, gradients sneak, a whisper of bottom current from the west. A slow fall of food this week, because a bloom far above reached the end of its generosity. A memory of internal waves that sweep the seafloor with barely a wrinkle, and yet sort grains and carry odour and larvae in long patient streaks. In that moving fabric, animals make practical decisions that, multiplied by a neighbourhood, look like design. Holes align not to an abstract grid but to the invisible wind, the better to ventilate deepest chambers with the least effort. The spacing is a compromise between economics and safety, close enough to share, far enough to avoid mean little wars, and still, not every dotted line on the abyss is written by mouths and hands. Pockmarks, small collapse pits where gas has delivered a brief sermon and gone, speckle entire provinces. They come in solitary phrases and in clusters like freckles, and when the gas lapses into seep rather than belch, bacterial mats frost the edges and beg mussels and clams to settle for a life spent harvesting energy with symbionts instead of sunlight. Your cameras have seen small, perfectly round dimples where methane nibbled at quicksand layers and the ceiling sagged into a tidy bowl. They have seen larger, messier pairs where the roof gave way in one gulp and took a memory of the subsurface with it. Those features rarely align like thread and needle rows, but in some places subtle faults, long as counties and thin as a rumour, guide seeps into lines that look almost like decisions. The seafloor breaks its poker face for a minute and shows where it's weak. You pass over a section where the holes are not holes at all, but little volcanoes the size of thimbles, each with a moat of cleaner sediment around it. The moats are telling. Something inside is pushing water out with enough steady oomph to sweep fines over the lip and lay a clear collar. Around half the mouths, a faint ring of orange stains the mud, the kind of colour iron wears when it makes peace with oxygen, a hint that fluids from deeper layers are being traded at the surface. You rest a flume probe over one and, stubbornly slow, the meters nod. Upward flow, not much, but not nothing either. Strange to call it a spring when it lives under an ocean, but strange is only a measure of habit. And the habit up here is that water falls and lies still, not that it rises in little breaths from underneath. Beneath you the marching dots take on an almost calligraphic flourish, curving as they pass the toe of a low mound, then straightening as soon as they clear the slope. The mound itself is a modest work of a shrimp or a crab, pellets stacked and smoothed, a living room below ventilated by whichever hole is currently fashionable. You imagine the tenant is the kind who values fresh air and keeps the place neat. The holes downstream are brighter, as if fresher. Picture this. The occupant opens an upstream intake overnight to drink oxygen, closes it by morning, and opens the lee side exhaust to exhale carbon dioxide and ammonia. The placement is weather savvy and anchored in no more mystery than breathe better. The manipulator lowers a soft corer, and you take a plug of sediment beside the line. A cake of the deep layers of fine silt and minuscule shells of foraminifera, dust from deserts a hemisphere away, opal shards of Farges diatom rain. In the core, the boundary between fluff and firm lies less than a centimetre down, and further the silt grows into something buttery, then something almost clay. Somewhere between those textures live the engineers, polychaetes with parchment tubes, amphipods that rake and retreat, tiny bivalves that suck and breathe and pump, and by pumping keep chemistry fresh for themselves and their neighbours. You take another core across a hole and it comes up ugly and beautiful at once, disturbed, banded with little collapse planes, where your intrusion folded the roof onto the hallway below, syllables of architecture you can read even as you apologise for having unroofed someone's parlour. There are other marks in this text that look like dots until you remember to change your scale. A scattering of large, dark circles turns out to be the mouths of burrows, whose tenants decorate with pebbles and shell bits as if a porch required a necklace. A string of very tiny perforations, barely larger than a pin, runs an inch or two above the bed like a sentence written by a shy typewriter. Polychaeta irrigation chimneys so delicate they collapse at the first sneeze of current. And then, far off to the starboard edge of the lights, you catch a grid, faint, criss-crossing seams in the fluff layer that break into dots where the lines intersect. For a breath, your heart leaps at geometry until the memory of internal wave cells settles again. The seabed can, under certain conditions, wear a pattern sewn by oscillating flows that arrange fine grains into quiet quilts. From time to time the rows end with a flourish that invites a story. A final hole a little larger than the rest, rim scalloped, beside it an empty snail shell and a small pile of coarser sand. The urge to write entrance on your screen is strong. A little further. Two adjacent rows kink toward each other and merge at a single shared opening, a marriage arch over a parlour the size of your forearm. Share house, you think, roommates practical about plumbing. The plane is simple from altitude. It is only down here, inside the lowercase letters of its text, that you see how many arrangements of life can occupy a square metre of mud without any of them raising their voices. Someone once asked if the rows might be machine traces or debris prints, and that is not a foolish question so much as a human one. We are good at leaving straight lines where we pass. But here the lines ignore the straightest geography and bend with subtle energies we barely measure. When you leave a marker and come back a month later, some holes have shifted their brightnesses, some have closed, some new ones have opened a metre along, and none of this tracks with any ship route or instrument drag. It tracks with the patience of animals that have been mastering this for as long as there has been silt to breathe through, with the intermittent pulse of subsurface fluids that pretend to be still and are not, with the clause-by-clause revision a neighbourhood performs on itself when the bottom current points a little more north than usual. You try a small experiment because experiments are a way of listening. Over one stretch you scatter a sparse sprinkle of neutrally buoyant beads and back away. The beads settle and then, incredibly slowly, begin to gather at the downstream lips of certain holes as if a giant had breathed in under the bed and the dust had chosen its draughts. Over another stretch you place a shield that blunts the flow for a few metres. A week later, the rims are asymmetrical on the unshielded side and rounder and more tentative on the lee. A difference meaningful only because it repeats. The plane is telling you gently that most of these dots live by the grace of flows, too shy to show themselves without props, and that what looks like the absence of weather is actually a weather so polite it takes hours to introduce itself. Now and then you find contradictions on purpose. A perfectly straight, freshly minted row cuts across a field of older, ragged holes like a new path worn through a meadow. The fresh rims shine, the spacing is almost ruler-wise, and if you stitch the drone images together, the row continues for tens of meters. You imagine a traveller beneath, worm or shrimp, choosing not to reuse the old burrow but to push a new tunnel through a layer that, for reasons only it needs to know, is more promising. The old holes collapse one by one like unused doorways in a house whose floor plan is being rewritten. You can hold both truths at once, that the plane forgets slowly and that it edits constantly. Critters move through the scene like punctuation marks added after the sentence was drafted. A sea star ambles across a line of holes and pauses with one arm delicately draped over a rim. It tests and retracts, uninterested. A squat lobster trots along the same row in a diagonal, disappears into one mouth and emerges 3 holes down, antennae tasting the ceiling as if the hallway were a favourite shortcut. A transparent eel larva, ribbon thin, lies with its head tucked just inside a hole's shadow, as if it borrowed a doorway to sit out a draught. The holes host without ceremony. There is no sign posted above them. Hospitality is incidental and entirely sufficient. If you were to teach patience, you would use this place as a chalkboard. You would draw how small, repeated acts, one pellet moved, one breath pushed, one grain stuck to a rim, become a signature you can see from 20 meters up. You would underline how the signature says present and recent and alive better than any big dramatic thing could do. You would remind yourself that mystery is not a gap, but an invitation to keep watching with tools that do not insist on answers louder than the questions. And then, because you're a creature of habits too, you would let the ROV drift a little and find the next line of dots, and the next, until the plane's long, soft grammar has taught you to see rows where yesterday there was only grey, and to read in those rows a neighbourhood of quiet decisions, all of them tidy, all of them provisional, all of them continuing just out of sight beneath the skin of the world. The descent does not feel like falling so much as being let in. The angles of the slope soften into a V that deepens until the world narrows to a corridor between walls of shadow, and the instruments begin to speak in numbers that sound like fiction, until you remember pressure is just patience multiplied by depth. The trench is a fold in the planet where one plate bows to another and slides beneath. A long, quiet hinge that runs for hundreds of kilometres and gathers the ocean into itself the way a valley gathers wind. Down here, time is layered in silt. The floor looks simple from a distance, grey, even, anonymous, but up close, it's a record player's groove. Fine lines of history laid one on top of another by storms you never saw, blooms you never counted, landslides that began as a whisper of sand on a slope 2 continents away. The trench catches what the open ocean lets fall and what the margins let go. Where a slope fails and becomes a turbidity current, an underwater avalanche that turns water to liquid earth, the trench is the bowl that receives it, and afterward the plain is a fresh page dusted with powder that once was cliff and shell and riverbed. The weight comes on like a mood. At 1,000 meters, the whole conversations become a little lower. At 4,000, silence sharpens. Beyond 6, you feel the water's attention, a steady, impersonal embrace that would make any emptiness scream if it could. Bones become suggestions rather than structures. Gas is a rumour no one repeats. Animals that belong here wear softness as armour. Gelatinous skins that transmit pressure rather than resist it. Oils and waxes where others would try air. Cartilage where bone would break. Calcium used sparingly like a rare spice. A fish passes and looks as if the idea of fish has been pared down to essential verbs: hover, sip, sense, glide. The Hadal snailfish, delicate as silk, carries scarcely any calcified weight. Its skull is more yielding than fortresses on the shelf, its muscles mild, its body a careful compromise, where every rigid thing has been negotiated into something that will not crack under the hand of the sea. At these depths, chemistry acts like architecture. Proteins that would lose their shape under pressure are chaperoned by small molecules that hold them steady, little braces in a house that would otherwise flex too far. Membranes pack their lipids just so to keep their surfaces from turning into glass. Enzymes find new ways to move electrons along so a breath can still be worth the effort. Every step in metabolism is tested against a physics that tries, gently but relentlessly, to slow it all down. There is a limit out there somewhere, a place where the tricks no longer buy enough time, and yet here bodies have found a thick shore between impossible and simple and built themselves on it without complaint. The floor of the trench is not empty of light. It makes its own in tiny practical moments. An amphipod lands on bait and triggers a slow halo of bioluminescence in the microbes that coat a nearby scrap. A soft chemical gasp that fades before you can decide if you imagined it. A sea cucumber, plump, pink, oddly cheerful, galumphs across the silt like a zeppelin that learned to crawl, and as it goes, tiny animals disturbed from their hiding write brief answers in sparks. Even the mud seems to glow under the right eyes, not with light but with meaning. A faint fur of bacteria etches the surface like frost on a window, mottled where oxygen has been consumed by the lives you cannot see. Bright where fresh water percolates upward through pores and brings a new measure of breath. Food is an event here, not a condition. The daily rain from above is thinner in the trenches than on the slopes and shelves because so much is eaten on the way down, turned and turned again. What arrives most days is a fine snowfall of carbon and dust, enough for those who have learned to be deliberate with want. Then there are the gifts that break the rule, a whalefall that drifts like a small moon and settles into gravity with a hush, ribs turning into arches, vertebrae into stations where sulfide-breathing microbes set up shop and then call in clams and worms to share the dividend. A tree torn from a bank and sent out by a flood. Now, a logjam for amphipods and isopods who find in its soggy corridors a sweetness that tastes like a distant summer. A slide from the wall that thickens the water for hours and drops a lightless storm across the plain. The community flexes around these feasts without frenzy. Scavengers gather quickly as if the trench had texted them. Bristling worms ribbon under skin and between bones. Microbes bloom in shadows and write new chemistry on old calcium. If you follow the floor to where it tilts up again, the wall is stippled with organisms that look like punctuation at first, and then, with closer light, become architecture. Xenophyophores, giant single cells that collect grains and glue them in delicate houses, sit like fallen stars, each a glittering dust sculpture with arms and folds and courtyards. Their interiors are rooms for other lives. Their surfaces gather crumbs. Their presence says as plainly as speech that wholeness comes in many sizes, some of them mostly patience. Snailfish sometimes lay their eggs among their folds, trusting the fragile mansions of a unicell to cradle the next breath. Between these houses run the tracks of small holothurians, S-bent grooves like cursive lines scoring the slope. Amphipods pepper the scene like commas. Sound, when it arrives, is history measured in pops. The trench is a listening station for the planet. Far off, a fault decides to unclench a centimetre, and the basal rocks murmur. Nearer, a patch of slope translates tension into a rattle of grains, a soft freight train noise that grows and then snuffs out when the slide spreads onto the floor and stops. Sometimes the instruments catch a long, low thrum as waves aloft press and lift the deep with barometric grace. In those tones, the animals continue in the way that bodies do when weather is merely room tone, unbothered, unhurried, exact. A snailfish hovers and opens its mouth and closes it. A small, translucent sea cucumber raises its bouquets of feeding tentacles in a patient starburst and then folds them again over the mouth that is also the front door. Where the trench bends near an island arc, seepage stews in pockets the way kettles do when the lid is not quite on. Tiny seeps make little white lawns of microbial mat and draw in clams that carry the sea's most private symbionts, bacteria that eat methane or sulfide and pay their rent in sugar. Here and there a mud volcano rises the height of a person and exhales fluids rich with things that deeper rocks have been chewing on, hydrogen and simple organics, taste that early life might have known. Community gathers at these breathers as around hearths. The trench on some nights smells of chemistry more than biology, if smelling were something you could do safely at this pressure. The edge of life down here looks less like a hard line and more like a spectrum of obligations. Microbes shoulder the hardest physics and carry on almost anywhere you can keep water liquid. They press into sediments at pressures that would make steel whimper and find a way to make a living out of the thin gradients in a single grain's width. Larger animals negotiate narrower contracts. Fish taper out around places where the chemical braces for proteins can't be braced any further without breaking something else. Their limit is a murky shoreline always being resurveyed by a brave, gentle body shaped like a whisper of a fish, fins as soft as question marks. Crustaceans continue deeper, their joints arranged for this weight, their blood chemistry leaning in the right direction, their appetites willing to commute for hours between scarcity and sudden festival. Worms right their tunnels and bring water along down a metre or two below the floor, pulling oxygen into quiet parties that would suffocate without the effort. Everywhere, edge is really terms, and life signs its name under terms that shift with temperature and salt and the slow leak of small currents. Isolation does its old, intricate work. Trench to trench, the cast changes, as if the theatre recast the same play with local actors who favour slightly different timing. A snailfish with a different jaw, an amphipod with a variation on a shell's hinge, a worm whose tube is thicker here and thin there, ocean above, one, ocean below, many, stitched together by a high hallway of currents and a low lattice of sediments and slides. Larvae launched from one interior may drift to the next if currents are kind, otherwise a lineage bends to fit this groove and quietly becomes particular. Endemism blooms without trumpet, visible only to those who return with the same tools and eyes and notice that the same bait, at the same depth, under the same moon, drew faces here that were cousins but not twins as to the faces in a trench 1,000 kilometres away. The tools we send to look are learning manners. Landers that fall like thimbles, carrying bait and cameras that can keep their own counsel for days, have shown that patience is the key language at the bottom of the column. When the lander thumps into the silt, it becomes a hill, and hills attract lives that prefer edges to plains. Amphipods arrive first in a rain of wings that are not wings. A snailfish appears as if edited into the frame by the trench itself. Eelpouts snake along the side as if reading braille. Minutes stretch, hours collect. In the long view, you can see the size of the neighbourhood by how many faces stop by and how quickly some are replaced by others when a bigger appetite enters the scene. The lander leaves the way it came, up in a burst trailing a tail of silt, and the hill collapses like a souffle, soon erased by the plane's habit of smoothing everything until the next disturbance writes again. Here too the planet writes with pressure. The arc overhead is a row of islands born from magma that wrung itself out of the downgoing plate. The earthquakes that shake those islands redesign the trench in quiet drafts. A wall slumps and an old terrace is buried. A ridge folds and a new terrace is born, and suddenly there is a fresh line of niche where before there was only slope. Xenophirephores move in, sea cucumbers test the grade, amphipods write their little pilgrimage dots across the new sand. It is a city without a zoning board, endlessly rebuilt by tremors and gravity, its tenants sealed at returning the furniture to the right rooms before the dust even settles. If you look very closely, the mud has weather. Beneath the top millimetre of fluff is a zone where oxygen dwindles and coefficients change sign, where iron prefers one state lower and sulphur looks for a partner. The depth of that change tells you the budget here. A thicker oxygenated skin when the rain was light, a thinner when a feast has been going on. Small animals push the boundary downward with their pumps and burrows, gardening the chemistry so they and their neighbours can keep handwriting the rules in their favour. In that way, the most extreme place behaves like every other functioning neighbourhood. Maintenance, shared without meeting, keeps the block livable. You sit with all this and find the edge begins to feel like the wrong picture. What you are watching is more an asymptote, the line that life approaches and rides along, close enough to measure, but never exactly touching, because touching would mean stopping. The approach is made of tricks, sugar held in molecules that stiffen in just the right way. Membranes knit more tightly, but not so tight they stop being doors. Skeletons made of what will bend and still suggest a frame. Hearts that beat slowly enough that the world can push back without breaking them. It is made of behaviours too. Hover rather than sprint. Sip rather than gulp. Accept a feast as an exception. Treat silence as a resource. Use the hill that wasn't there yesterday, and be ready to move when it isn't there tomorrow. Above the trench, the surface insists on weather, on glare and chop and statements scribbled by wind. Down here, the weather is granular, millimetre winds and hour-long gusts of chemistry, but the result is the same kind of comfort, patterns that can be leaned on. A snailfish faces into a thread of current no thicker than a wrist, and parks behind a pebble the size of a thumbnail. An amphipod, large for its lineage in this gravity of water, folds over bait with the politeness of a picnic and then yields when something larger arrives, retreating a body length and cleaning its antennae, as if to say it was already done. A holothurian uses water like a conveyor belt to deliver a precise sprinkling of silt to its mouth, rejecting grains too coarse with a fussiness that feels like craft rather than pickiness. The trench is not hostile so much as exacting. It pays those who can read its small scripts. There are questions we carry down and bring back up again, unweakened by cold or weight. Is there a depth that says no in all cases for bodies larger than cells, or will the strategies continue to find purchase a little farther each time someone is patient enough to look? When a generation of animals writes its life into one trench, how much of that writing can another trench read? Are there courier currents that trade stories between them, or does each groove on the planet's skins teach its own alphabet and expect residents to become literate all over again? If a sudden pulse of food, storm-born, slope-failed, whale-scent changes a neighbourhood's arithmetic, how long does the memory last in bodies that measure years in slow muscle and slow eggs? The instruments that come back with mud under their fingernails will keep answering with numbers that taste like poetry if you're tired enough to read them that way. When the ascent begins, it is not because the trench is done talking, but because your clock is. The lander floats, the cable hums, the darkness thins by imperceptible degrees, until the idea of blue draws a line through the black. Above, squall lines write quick calligraphy on the skin of the sea, and as Shearwater glances down without any notion of the math below its shadow. The trench keeps its own counsel. On its floor, A thin, fresh ribbon of silt has just halted after sliding the last half-metre. A sea cucumber has turned and made a mirrored groove next to the one it wrote an hour ago. A snailfish has eased 3 body lengths to the left and found a new pebble to shadow behind. Xenophyrophores have collected 3 more grains each. Microbes have moved a single layer deeper and made a decision about iron. And somewhere in the half-distance between pressure and pressure, a body you have not met yet is practicing the small compromise that will let it belong here tomorrow. If you're still awake with me here at the edge of the night, thank you for drifting through the deep. We've listened for voices that travel farther than sight, watched whole seas turn to milk under a moon, followed the nightly elevator of tiny lives stood at the shores of lakes that lie beneath the ocean, warmed our hands beside black chimneys, traced the patient shadows of giants, peered through a windowed head into a sky of plankton stars, wandered nurseries where mothers keep time with their hearts, and read, dot by dot, the quiet punctuation of the abyss until we reach the soft frontier where pressure writes its own rules. The surface feels very far away and very close at once, a roof we carry inside us. If your breathing has found a slower tide while we travelled, that's exactly the pace the ocean likes. In and out. Unhurried, unforced, the way a current carries a single feather of light. Before you go, tell me, which mystery tugged at you the most tonight? Was it the steady glow of a milky sea, the velvet thunder of the bloop's distant rumour, the octopus gardens warmed by the gentlest seep, or the calm emerald gaze of a fish that looks up through its own clear helmet? Leave your favourite moment in the comments, along with the city and country where you're listening from, so this quiet little crew can stretch a thread of light across the map. I love seeing your dots appear like bioluminescence after dark, each one a small harbour of curiosity. If this journey soothed you, I'd be grateful if you'd help it reach the next tired traveller. Please subscribe, like the video, and ring the notification bell. Those 3 simple ripples tell the algorithmic currents to carry us a little farther, and they make sure the next midnight tide finds you right on time. If you want a friend to sleep a little easier tonight, share this with them. Let them step into the water, where the voices are gentle and the clocks are kind. Here's a secret I keep learning every time we return below. Answers are never the only treasure. The ocean gives us better questions, ones with soft edges that fit into the palm like sea glass. Why do some sounds arrive each winter then fade like breath on a window? How does an animal's patience become architecture? A ring of shells, a tidy doorway, a row of dots that looks like a thought. What other rooms, tucked behind pressure and quiet, wait just beyond the light we carry? It's okay not to know. It's more than okay. It's the reason to keep listening. The sea is a library that's always open, and most of the books are written in languages we learn by sleeping on them a while. If your eyes are heavy, let them be. Imagine the surface above you smoothing out, all the day's whitecaps ironing themselves flat. Imagine the deep scattering layer easing downward, a weighted blanket of tiny lives settling into their cool pillows. Imagine a hydrophone somewhere, faithful and patient, writing the night into memory so you don't have to. You can hand the watching over to the instruments. You can hand the questions to the morning. For now, all that's asked of you is to float. When you do wake, whether it's in 20 breaths or with the sun, come back and tell me what you want to explore next. We can follow a whale fall from first hush to last whisper, walk the chalky balconies of an alkaline vent, ride an internal wave as it combs the water like a hand through hair, or chase a single fleck of marine snow from sky to seafloor and see everyone it feeds along the way. If you have a story of your own, a night crossing, a lighthouse foghorn, the way a tide sounded through your window as a child, leave it below. This channel works best when it feels like a ship's log that many hands have signed. If you'd like to keep the calm within arm's reach, Click subscribe, tap like, and ring the bell so our next voyage finds you. It truly helps. And if you want even gentler nights, there are more sleepy journeys waiting on the channel. Forest canopies and desert stars, sleepy paleontology, midnight chemistry dreamed slowly, and other deep-sea chapters we haven't opened yet. You're welcome aboard any time. There's always room on this deck for one more blanket and one more quiet curiosity. For now, think of the octopus garden dimming its lanterns, each mother fanning her eggs in the steady rhythm that lulls a slope to stillness. Think of the barrel eye's green gaze returning to the ceiling, the siphonophores' slow parade continuing like a soft procession of candles. Think of the giant squid folding back into the dark with the composure of weather. Think of the trench laying down a single new line of silk-thin silt, a sentence fragment the world will read much later. Everything is doing exactly what it knows how to do. You are too. I'll keep watch a little while longer. The sea will hum low, the instruments will draw their quiet lines, and the living quilt will turn once in its sleep. If your thoughts start to drift, let them slip beneath their own thermocline, where noise thins and signals are simple. If a worry surfaces, give it a small wave from the rail and let it pass astern. You don't need to follow it. Tonight the only migration is toward rest. Thank you for spending your evening with the Sleepy Oceanographer. Your presence here, your listening, your kindness in the comments, your click on the little bell makes this tiny boat feel like a fleet. I hope the ocean leaves you lighter than it found you, a little more in step with the big, slow metronomes beneath our feet. Until next time, keep a pocket of quiet with you. Breathe like tide and remember that the dark isn't empty. It's gentle, it's generous, and it keeps its promises to those who arrive softly. Subscribe if you haven't yet, like this if it helped. Ring the bell so the next calm finds you exactly when you need it, and share this with someone who could use a long, deep breath. I'll meet you again where the water grows thoughtful and the clocks run slow. For now, let's let the waves do the talking and drift together into the kindest part of night.